Good afternoon. Good afternoon and a warm welcome to all of you to the launch of IDMC's 2022 Global Report on Internal Displacement. My name is Alexandra Bilak, Director of IDMC, and I will be moderating today's event. Dear ambassadors, dear partners and colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, it's a pleasure seeing so many of you in person today. It really is a rare treat for us after 2 years of the pandemic, and it's also, of course, at the same time wonderful to have so many people participating virtually from around the world. So welcome to all of you. I'm going to be joined by some very special guest speakers here in the room and also online, who I'll be introducing to you all very shortly. Before we begin, just a few logistical questions. I'd like to inform you that we have interpretation in Arabic, French, and Spanish available today. So if you're here with us in the room, please use the headphones that are provided on the tables. If you're joining us online, you'll see on your Zoom screen the interpretation button at the bottom there. It should be self-explanatory. For Arabic interpretation, click Arabic. French, etc. Today's event is an opportunity for us to put a much-needed spotlight on the world's internally displaced people, and in particular to look at what the future holds for them. We chose to focus this year's report on children and youth for several reasons. The first was because in terms of numbers alone, children and young people today make up half of the world's IDP population. This in itself should be cause for collective concern. But also, and perhaps more importantly, we feel that the way we respond to their needs today will shape what their future looks like and likely have profound effects for the generations to come. And there's no denying, unfortunately, that right now that future looks very bleak. The number of people living in internal displacement has reached record levels. There are twice as many IDPs today as there were 10 years ago. And this precedes the crisis in Ukraine, which has displaced close to 12 million people since February, 8 million of whom inside the country. As you'll see from our report, it shows very clearly that today people are fleeing multiple threats that are caused by a combination of political, but also environmental, social, and economic factors. Across the world, conflicts combined with weather and climate disasters are causing increasingly protracted forms of displacement. And as if this wasn't already enough, the COVID-19 pandemic and the war in Ukraine are compounding these crises. They're exacerbating people's vulnerabilities, and they're creating situations that are becoming more and more difficult to resolve. These effects, of course, are being felt most strongly in low and middle-income countries, but also within poorer and more disadvantaged communities. Parts of Africa will be entering their 5th consecutive failed rainy season later this year, and they're hard hit by a global rise in food prices, which has led to acute food insecurity and put tens of millions of people at risk of famine. Together with conflict, this is leading to people becoming displaced repeatedly and facing the risk of a permanent loss of homes and livelihoods. It's clear to us that we can no longer dispute the close relationship that exists between conflict, disasters, food insecurity, and displacement. The 4 countries with the highest numbers of severely food insecure people in the world, which are DRC, Yemen, Afghanistan, and Syria, are also conflict affected and among the 5 with the highest numbers of IDPs. Across all these crises, children and young people face very specific challenges. In Ethiopia, drought is causing malnutrition in children and a rise in early child marriages. In Burkina Faso and Somalia, conflicts and food insecurity are leading to school closures, which are affecting tens of thousands of children by interrupting their education cycles. And in Syria, high levels of food insecurity in IDP sites means that people are resorting to negative coping mechanisms, including child labor and child marriage, and that children are dropping out of school as a result. So it would be easy to look at these challenges and feel a sense of despair and hopelessness. But despite these challenges, we feel that there is reason for some optimism. We're starting to identify and to document promising practices from around the world that we believe can be replicated and scaled up. What these practices show is what can be achieved when political will, resourcing, and skills come together. We're also seeing growing awareness and commitment by governments and the international community, acknowledging that action is needed now to prevent and to find lasting solutions to internal displacement. As you know, the year 2021 was marked by the publication of the report and the recommendations of the high-level panel on internal displacement. And I've certainly seen an increase, I have to say, in interest and engagement from a whole range of stakeholders, often at the highest levels of decision-making. They reaffirm that responding to internal displacement requires long-term investments, joined-up action across humanitarian, peace-building and development work, and of course, much more decisive political leadership. We're looking forward to the UN Secretary-General's forthcoming action agenda on internal displacement, and of course to working with his newly appointed special advisor to improve coordination and support for durable solutions across the UN system and in partnership with governments. Another key moment this year for us will be the 27th United Nations Climate Change Conference of the Parties in Egypt, where we hope to see renewed commitments by governments to decrease greenhouse gas emissions and accelerate climate change adaptation, sustainable development, and disaster risk reduction. But within this, it's the support to countries who bear the brunt of climate-related impact that needs to be at the center of these commitments. And we look forward in this respect to continuing working with our government partners around the globe to build dialogue and to share knowledge and good practices around this issue. But perhaps most importantly, the biggest reason for hope is because the children and the young adults who are experiencing displacement today can and will and should become agents of change in the future. For this, they need to be seen, they need to be heard, and they need to be included in the decisions that will ultimately shape the world that they will inherit. So I look forward to the discussion that we're going to have this afternoon that will very much focus on how we can make this happen. So let us move to the first part of today's program, starting with a video-recorded keynote speech by Ms. Catherine Russell, Executive Director of the UN Children's Fund. While we're setting up the video, I'd like to take this opportunity to thank the Executive Director and all our colleagues at UNICEF, many of whom are here today, for your global leadership on the issue of displaced children and youth, as well as your excellent cooperation with IDMC over the years. Our flagship report rests on the depth and the quality of our partnerships, and the one with UNICEF is certainly one of our most precious and appreciated. Over to you, Ms. Catherine Russell.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the launch of the 2022 Grid Report. On behalf of UNICEF, I want to thank our partners at the IDMC for focusing this year's report on internally displaced children and young people. As conflicts, crises, and climate emergencies multiply around the world, more children are becoming internally displaced. And the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic has exacerbated a problem that was already growing. By the end of 2021, we estimate that more than 30 million children and young people were internally displaced worldwide. They've been forced to flee their homes, their schools, their communities. Many have been deeply traumatized by everything they have experienced. Their lives and their futures are at risk. That is certainly the situation right now in Ukraine. The war has displaced millions of children inside the country. Their lives have been literally forced underground, sleeping, eating, learning, and playing in subway stations and basement bomb shelters. I recently visited a camp for internally displaced people in the Somali region of Ethiopia. I saw firsthand some of the challenges these children are facing. Some of them have known no other home but an IDP camp. This global report underscores both the short and long-term impacts of internal displacement on children and their communities. It lays out recommendations for the best way to reach these children and meet their urgent needs while building resilience for the future. This includes increased investment in real-time data to help prevent, respond, and resolve internal displacement. And it calls on all of us to engage more deeply with internally displaced children and young people themselves, looking past the numbers to see their individual lives, their dreams, and their hopes for the future. Every single one of these children has the right to reach their full potential. It's up to all of us to help them realize that right. UNICEF stands ready to roll up our sleeves in the coming months to help bring the new SG Action Agenda on internal displacement to life.
Displaced children
We know
are
that
counting on all
internally
of us.
displaced children are
We have to
counting
be
on all
there
of
for
us.
them.
We have to be there for them.
Thank you very much, Ms. Russell. Thank you very much for these words, which provide the perfect framing for today's discussion that will indeed focus on short and long-term impacts of displacement on children and communities and what can be done about it. So I will now hand over to IDMC's manager of our Global Monitoring and Reporting Hub, Mr. Vicente Anzellini, who's going to present the key findings of this year's report. Vicente is the coordinator and one of the lead authors of this report. Over to you, Vicente.
Good afternoon, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining us today as we launch IDMC's 7th Global Report on Internal Displacement, this year with a special focus on internally displaced children and youth. It is my pleasure to present the key findings, take stock of the scale of this global challenge, and look together at the opportunities ahead. I would like to start by highlighting that despite the yearly variations, internal displacement has not seen a decline in the last decade. Last year, we recorded 38 million internal displacements, or movements, the second highest annual figure in a decade after 2020's record-breaking year of disaster displacement. These trends should be a major cause of concern, especially considering that they are set to continue increasing in 2022, as many crises are still ongoing, and the war in Ukraine has displaced nearly 8 million people since February. Conflict and violence led to 14.4 million movements in 2021. This is the highest figure we have ever recorded. It was largely driven by the crisis in northern Ethiopia, ongoing violence in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and the Taliban takeover in Afghanistan. Across these three countries, the figures were also the highest ever recorded. A sharp increase in internal displacement also took place in Myanmar, where a military takeover reignited long-running conflicts and sparked armed resistance. Across all these crises, food insecurity remains concerning, and the situation for many IDPs has not been resolved. Sub-Saharan Africa was the region most affected, accounting for more than 80% of the global total internal displacements by conflict and violence. This is also the highest figure we have ever recorded in this region. Beyond Ethiopia and the DRC, Burkina Faso, Somalia, and the Central African Republic all recorded high numbers. Drought, food insecurity, and attacks against civilians were some of the main factors that pushed millions from their homes, sometimes repeatedly. Conversely, displacement in the Middle East and North Africa region in 2021 was the lowest in 10 years, as conflict in Syria, Libya, and Iraq de-escalated, though violence continued in Yemen and reignited in Palestine. However, across this region, the overall number of people still uprooted as of the end of the year remained high, as IDPs have not found a durable solution to their displacement. Supporting long-term peace-building and development initiatives is more needed than ever in this region that remains affected by protracted displacement. Moving on to disasters and the impacts of climate change, we recorded 23.7 million internal displacements in 2021. Although figures were lower than the previous years, the overall trends mirrored the decade trends, with China, the Philippines, and India being some of the most affected countries. Many of the movements were in the form of preemptive evacuations, which are a life-saving measure, but the extent of housing destruction in many of the disasters that we recorded throughout the year suggests that many IDPs also face the prospect of prolonged displacement. Also mirroring previous years, highly exposed and densely populated areas across the East Asia and Pacific region were the most affected. Nearly 60% of the total disaster displacement was recorded in this region alone, where figures were the highest since 2016. In terms of other regions, the Atlantic hurricane season and the rainy seasons across South Asia and Africa were less severe than the year before, leading to less movements. However, the phenomenon still occurred in around 70% of the world countries and territories, which demonstrate its global footprint. Drought conditions and extreme temperatures triggered wildfires in the Middle East and North Africa, the Americas, and Europe. Some areas of the US and the Mediterranean experienced their hottest summer on record. Countries including Australia, Canada, and Germany suffered widespread floods, reminding us that high-income countries are equally exposed to disaster displacement. Weather-related hazards accounted for 94% of the total disaster displacements. However, geophysical hazards such as earthquakes and volcanic eruptions were significant drivers of internal displacement in 2021. The Nyiragongo volcanic eruption in the DRC triggered an estimated 600,000 movements. It was the volcanic eruption triggering the highest number of displacements globally since data has been available, and also affected those uprooted by conflict and violence in the province of North Kivu. So be it in the DRC, Afghanistan, Somalia, or South Sudan, we are observing a trend in which conflicts and disasters are colliding. Their compounding impacts are functioning as drivers of further vulnerability and displacement risk. Despite the figures in this report being presented in separate metrics, overlapping crises had a severe knock-on effect on food security and heightened the vulnerability of millions. This is a trend we're seeing today, as we speak, in the Horn of Africa, where drought, food insecurity, and conflict are overlapping, pushing a high number of people into displacement. The war in Ukraine is also having significant impacts on food and oil prices, which is having impacts at a global scale, also affecting the lives of IDPs. This chart shows a different metric, which is the total number of IDPs as of end of the year. And as you can see, we are observing an increasing trend. Last year, we estimated that 59.1 million people were internally displaced globally by both conflict and disasters. The figure is an all-time high and was more than 4 million higher than the previous year, and the equivalent of the population of Italy. A significant proportion of those displaced have been living in a situation of protracted displacement, especially in Syria, the DRC, and Colombia, that continue to host the largest number of IDPs, followed by Afghanistan and Yemen. At least 5.9 million have been uprooted by disasters, but this is only the third year we have produced such a figure. And given the lack of data, it should be considered a significant underestimate. Much more is needed to strengthen our collective efforts to lower these ever-increasing trends and prevent and address protracted crises. Another key finding of this year's grid is that the direct economic impacts of internal displacement worldwide were estimated to amount to more than $21 billion in 2021. This includes the cost of providing every IDP with support to their housing, education, health, and security, and accounts for the loss of income for 1 year of displacement. It is not taking into consideration the longer-term financial implications for IDPs, host communities, and governments more broadly, and should therefore be considered also conservative. It is difficult to disentangle whether the COVID-19 pandemic caused, prolonged, or worsened a particular crisis. What we do know is, As countries restricted movement to fight the spread of the virus, displaced populations bore the brunt of the impacts on their income, food security, and access to services. This, in turn, hampered many to return home or move onwards to safe havens. This year's report has a special focus on internally displaced children and youth, and look at how displacement affects young people's safety, health, and education, as well as longer-term social and economic repercussions for future generations. These impacts are unfortunately visible today in Yemen, where deteriorating conditions have left millions of children malnourished, or in Afghanistan, where many displaced children and youth are still deprived from education, or in Ukraine, where 2/3 of the country's child population have been uprooted. Around 33 million, or more than half of the world internally displaced people, are young people under the age of 25. Many children are uprooted for years, and some young adults spend their entire childhood in displacement. Displacement can undermine their development, set them back in fulfilling their potential, and erode their resilience to future shocks. The impacts of displacement vary depending on their age, gender, and other characteristics. The repercussions extend beyond the individual to their family and community for the years to come. What I'm going to present on the next slides is the overall top findings of the report. We have heard some very interesting interventions in this morning's session, and we will hear more throughout the panel regarding what comes next, what comes to in the future. So, starting by protection, displaced children are at a high risk of violence, abuse, exploitation, and neglect. They may become separated from their families during their flight, and if they lose their identity documents, it may be difficult to reunite them with their families. The financial difficulties IDPs tend to face may force children to engage in dangerous income-generating activities, including crime, transactional sex, or joining armed groups. Girls are a particular risk of gender-based violence, as has been documented in Haiti, while boys face greater risk of recruitment into armed groups, as has been documented in South Sudan. Strengthening child protection systems that consider these risks is essential. Evidence on IDPs' health and access to medical services shows that they tend to face greater challenges and worse health outcomes. Malnutrition rates may be particularly high for displaced children, even in areas where food insecurity is a wider challenge. Malnutrition impedes physical and cognitive development and has been associated with lower levels of education and social and economic productivity in adulthood. Poor living conditions, lack of clean water and sanitation, and reduced access to preventative measures and healthcare increase the risk of communicable diseases among displaced children and youth. Displacement can also interrupt vaccination programs, as has been the case in Syria, where immunization rates fell by around 46% from 2010 to 2017, leading to a resurgence of polio. Beyond the physical impacts, internal displacement can have negative outcomes on children's psychological well-being. Displaced children and youth, are largely equipped to deal with rarely equipped to deal with the disruption and trauma caused by displacement. There are promising steps, however. Countries including Bangladesh, Colombia, Sri Lanka, and Kenya, and I'm just here naming a few, have national laws and policies on internal displacement that recognize displaced children's need for psychological support, providing access to meaningful opportunities, a sense of connectedness, and agency in decision-making are some of the long-term investments needed to support them overcoming stress and trauma. The displacement of children and youth has an immediate effect on their education too. It usually interrupts schooling, sometimes only for a few days or weeks, but in other cases for much longer periods of time. The cost of inaction in addressing all displaced children's access to education goes far beyond negative impacts in the short term. Each year of schooling is estimated to increase an individual's earning potential by 10% in many countries. Improved access to education builds appetite for local integration and helps to discourage IDPs from going back to underserved or unsafe areas of origin. Prolonged displacement can undermine their development and set them back in fulfilling their potential. A healthy and happy child is more likely to contribute to an equitable society and a functioning economy, which in turn reduces the risk of repeated displacement. And this is my last slide, and I wanted to focus, as always, we do in IDMC, regard to the data gaps and what is needed on the way forward. Because if we are to address all these challenges in the years to come, we need more and better data on internally displaced children and youth. Today, they are particularly invisible in global and national data, especially compared with those who cross an international border. Even when data is collected, age groups are not standardized, making it difficult to compile national-level figures. Each demographic group faces specific risks and has specific needs. Infants may need nutritional supplements, school-age children educational inputs, and young people vocational training. Gender, disability status, and other aspects also have a direct influence on how children experience displacement, but such data is even more challenging to come by. So more data is needed to better understand how direct and immediate effects on children and young people fuel broader long-term impacts on communities and societies. In the meantime, recognizing them as agents of change is vital to protect development gains and reduce the risk of protracted and future crises. Preparing for the world of tomorrow must therefore start with their active participation and leadership. So I would like to end by saying that the GRID report, that those who are present, I hope all of you took your copies, and those who are online, of course, explored the landing page, but there's much more. We have also country pages, methodological annexes, and interacting datasets for you to download and play around with. So I invite everyone to explore all this data and content. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Vicente. A great presentation. I think there's a lot to reflect on based on this report. We've also had some very engaging discussions this morning in the technical segment, so I'm sure many of you will have a lot of questions. Great. It's great to see you all. What I suggest is, since I introduced you but without your faces online, why don't we just do a quick tour of the four of you? Maybe starting with Inge Asching. Welcome.
Thank you so much.
Oh, great. There you go. So nice to have you with us. Dr. Papadopoulos? Nina?
Yes, hello everyone. It's great to be here today with you and to really dig into these findings. Thank you.
Great, thank you. So just to specify, Inge is joining us from London and Nina from Washington, DC, I believe. Ehab, your turn. You're in Berlin.
Exactly. Hello, everyone. I'm Ehab from Berlin.
Great. And Jayatma, you're in New York. Great to meet you.
Hello. Thank you very much for the invitation. Very nice to be here.
Great. Okay, well, we can finally breathe a sigh of relief. So before we start, just a friendly reminder for the participants who are joining us online to share any questions you have by using the Q&A function. So my team will be collating all those questions and sending them to me after we've heard from all of you, and then hopefully we'll have some time to answer them in the Q&A. So as I was saying, what we've wanted to do this afternoon is to organize the discussion in two parts. The first part is really to follow a child through his or her displacement journey, starting from early childhood into primary, secondary education before going into young adulthood, so that we can really understand the different challenges that are faced in different stages of life for people who are on the move. So we'll be focusing this first section on better understanding the impacts that internal displacement can have at those different stages, but also highlighting already now some of the effective responses that are already out there and that could be replicated elsewhere. The second part of the discussion will focus more on what can be done from the national to the global level when it comes to policy development and new operational approaches. So without further ado, let me start with Nina, Dr. Papadopoulos. Perhaps you could start us off by telling us a little bit more about the specific challenges as you see them that very young children face in displacement, and again, some of the concrete approaches to promote their psychosocial well-being at this very young age.
Thank you very much. And what an honor it is to be here today. I'm so heartened to see the incredible work of the IDMC and to highlight the impacts of internal displacement on children and youth and advocate for effective policies and responses. This launch event is really the perfect opportunity to come together as a community in this space and think about how to strengthen our working relationships for all children, but especially those affected by conflict and displacement. Today, I want to give you a glimpse into Sesame Workshop's values that underpin all our work, tapping into local expertise, creating characters that children relate to, and giving them a language for their emotions. While Sesame Street is certainly best known for the groundbreaking television show that has been educating children for over 50 years, often folks are not aware of the depth and breadth of Sesame Workshop, a global nonprofit with a mission to help children everywhere grow smarter, stronger, and kinder. We focus intently on the critical early years because it's the most important time in terms of brain development, and it lays the foundation for lifelong learning, health, and productivity. Using the power of media and our lovable characters, Sesame reaches millions of children and caregivers around the world on mobile devices, in communities, in classrooms, through radio, and even WhatsApp and chatbot. In many places, we're reaching children who have no other access to quality early education. It's important to note that none of our media stands alone. We know our characters and storylines are more impactful when they're supported by direct services like curriculum, ECD centers, and of course, caring and nurturing adults. We're facing a global moment of compounding crises. Children and their families are displaced from their homes because of climate emergencies, public health emergencies, political instability, and ethnic conflict, just to name a few. And while one context is vastly different from the next, we know that all young children have similar needs for safety, stability, and nurturing care from an adult in order to grow and develop. Mitigating the trauma and stress that millions of children are experiencing means going beyond the cognitive basics to address social and emotional needs and give children a language to understand emotions. At Sesame, we call this the ABCs of emotions. Sesame has a long history of working around the world to tap into local cultures and languages to address social problems and early education challenges through co-creation, which is especially important in addressing child well-being. Our strategy goes beyond partnering with local actors. We really try to make space for the curiosity and creativity of local experts to take root and grow. For me, this is the essence of innovation and is part of what makes Sesame so powerful to make change in early education. My favorite example of this innovative partnering is Ahlan Simsim, which means welcome Sesame in Arabic. It's an early childhood development program designed to reach families affected by conflict and displacement in the Middle East, with a combination of a local version of Sesame Street in 20 countries and direct services in homes and ECD centers. Like all our co-productions throughout the world, we call on local knowledge, but this endeavor was even bigger. We needed experts in humanitarian response, which is why we partnered with the International Rescue Committee. Ahlan Simsim truly meets the needs of these communities affected by crises by placing their values and perspectives at the center of program design and at the center of their own stories. To get here, we consulted with psychologists, education experts, and local teachers to devise educational objectives, characters, and the narrative framework for the show. Ahlan Simsim has been intentionally crafted to support children's social and emotional learning, as well as caregivers' abilities to communicate with their children about emotions. The episodes take a step-by-step approach to build children's emotional vocabulary and help them develop a roster of self-regulation strategies, an approach designed to build foundational skills that research shows are linked to children's later functioning. Emotional experiences are also embedded in the social relationships between the characters. Across the first season, children are repeatedly exposed to terms aligned with core emotions like anger, caring, fear, frustration, and determination, and can watch the characters put coping strategies into practice, like belly breathing, counting to 5, asking for help, and expressing emotions through art. We like to call drawing it out as a specific strategy. The characters are modeling how to identify and regulate emotions through concrete strategies. And these characters have so much power. Their backgrounds, personalities, physical characteristics, and relationships to one another have been created to address the key themes identified by our research and advisors. For instance, Jad, an almost 6-year-old yellow Muppet who is new to the neighborhood, can paint mid-air using his grandfather's special brush. And Basma, a purple Muppet, has a special ability to create music and sound effects that comes in handy when she can't quite find the words to express herself. Basma and Jad model nonverbal and sensory-based models of expression, which are very useful tools for children and people of all ages, actually, who have experienced impacts on verbal expression due to trauma. Jad is also new to the Ahlan Simsim neighborhood, which provides us with the opportunity to address loss, making new friends, and entering new social groups. The human adult characters are trusted caregivers to the Muppets and have their own role to play in reinforcing messages about emotions. For example, Teta Noor is a vivacious grandmother figure who is ready to listen, give advice, and ask questions when Jad and Basma are experiencing big feelings. She allows us to model nurturing, positive care practices for parents and caregivers who are watching the show alongside their children. Research shows that when children watch our show with a nurturing adult, the learning is even deeper. Now, Ahlan Simsim is in its 5th season, and social and emotional learning is still at its core. This work with the Syrian response region has accelerated our learning on early education interventions in other crisis contexts. Through this work, we cannot deny the power of our characters and the power of children seeing themselves reflected on the screen, their cultures, languages, struggles, and emotions. We just could not have created such powerful characters without innovative partnering and building strong local relationships. It's in those relationships that I have a sense of hope and optimism for the future. Thank you.
So much, Nina. Thank you very much, Nina. I don't know how many of you in the room here today are familiar with Sesame Street, the TV program. It's very much, I think, more of an Anglophone thing than a Francophone one, but it's wonderful to see how Sesame Workshop has managed to roll out so many of those characters and tested out and proved the power of play in providing psychosocial support to children, particularly children living in displacement. I think, Nina, you've made a lot of excellent points that resonate very much with the discussions that we had this morning regarding the importance of cognitive development in the early stages, and how and the important role that that media can play in and that play can play in supporting children through these difficult periods. I think another key takeaway here is how we were also saying how it's not enough to simply say, you know, we need to provide education to children in displacement context. The education, the quality of the education and the type of support that can be given by setting education objectives that are aligned with a child's needs, with a child's emotions, and that is ultimately going to allow him or her to build those social relationships and develop those coping strategies that you mentioned is also key. So thank you very much for sharing those initial thoughts. We'll come back to them in a minute. I'm sure there'll be a lot of questions to you. As we've said as well, and it was part of the presentation, many of the IDP crises that we're facing today are very much protracted. They have long-lasting effects, but what it means is that a child who is born in displacement today is likely to grow up in displacement in his or her later years, which means that there are particular challenges that also come with providing the right kind of support, not just through education, but the right kind of support that is going to meet the very specific needs and vulnerabilities of children who are all, they're all unique and they all have individual needs. So what can be done to accompany them throughout this displacement trajectory as they start reaching primary and secondary school age? So I'll be turning now to Ms. Ashing to share some thoughts on the particular challenges, but also the opportunities that exist in providing support to children supporting to children when it comes to access to education or other means in those years. Over to you, Ms. Ashing.
Thank you so much, Alexandra. And first of all, I would like to congratulate the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center for the 2022 Global Report on Internal Displacement. It's a very important and a good report, and it's very useful to have this level of information analysis for organizations like Save the Children and everyone else participating today. And I also want to say that we are particularly pleased that the global report has a specific focus on children and youth, because it's a group that is often overlooked when we talk about displacement overall. And speaking about children and forced displacement, the numbers are staggering, as we've heard throughout the day. Children represents almost half of the world's forcibly displaced populations, which according to today's press release from UNHCR, has reached 100 million people for the first time on record. 100 million people, half of them being children. And as we learned today from the report, over 25 million children are in internal displacement. And we know that children are among the most vulnerable in displacement situations and in protracted crisis settings. And in fact, I've just returned from Mozambique, where I spent last week, where I've seen this reality firsthand in the northern part in Cabo Delgado. So let me touch on two key points that are crucial to uphold the rights of internally displaced children, to protect them and to respond to their needs. Firstly, we need to ask ourselves the question, what drives over 25 million children to flee their homes, their communities, and sometimes even become separated from their families? The reasons are multiple and complex, but it is important to understand the causes as they dictate what children experience in internal displacement. Conflict and violence, extreme poverty, the disruption of livelihoods due to environmental degradation, disasters, food insecurity, or economic shocks, exacerbated by the climate crisis, are just some of the intertwined causes of children's displacement. As environmental degradation worsens and climate conditions become more unpredictable and extreme, children's safety and well-being will also be further threatened, adding to the complex interplay of socioeconomic and political factors that lead to displacement. Understanding and addressing these root causes is key for us to plan for appropriate responses. to mitigate the negative impacts and support long-term solutions that are child-sensitive. Ambitious, committed climate action is key, in addition to investing in anticipatory action and addressing the root causes of conflict and fragility. We can make a real difference if we act urgently and put in place measures that are targeted and child-focused. However, in many responses, a child lens is missing. This leads me to my second point about the impact of displacement on children. Taking into account that of children, of course, is not a homogeneous group, but they have different needs depending on, among other things, their age, gender, and disability. But when we look at the impact of displacement, we need to keep in mind that children are affected in ways that are often quite different from what adults experience. So for a moment, I would like to invite all of us to think about what it would mean for a child to have to flee their home, their communities, and sometimes, tragically, their families. They find themselves in completely unfamiliar places, often without access to appropriate accommodation, to services or support, or too often becoming victims of discrimination. This was the reality of many of the children I met last week in Mozambique. Forced displacement completely shifted their lives. For many, displacement translates into a lack of access to key services, such as education, child protection, health, and sexual and reproductive health care. Children escaping conflict, violence, and persecution would have faced traumatic experiences before they left. And during their journey, many become exposed to increased risks of exploitation and abuse. They face child labor, trafficking, or child recruitment, various forms of violence, including physical and sexual violence, and other forms of gender-based violence and separation from their families. This is why child protection is a life-saving part of any humanitarian response and needs to be at the core of programs, investments, and solutions. Strengthening child protection systems that consider and respond to these risks is crucial. This means investing in and ensuring access to a continuum of care that recognizes the specific threats children face and respond to their needs. We have heard from children around the world who say that when a crisis and displacement happen, continuing education is what they want, first and foremost. This was also the message that the children of Mozambique shared with me. Attending school is a building block, not only for children's learning, but also for their well-being, sense of connectedness and health. It provides a safe space for children and support their access to food and nutrition. Unfortunately, internally displaced children have less access to education than their non-displaced peers. And certain groups of displaced children, such as children with disabilities, from minority communities, and very often girls, also face more barriers to education than others. And many families do not have they cannot afford school fees, uniforms, meals, or transportation, which also means that children are denied access to education. When displacement translates into disruptive education, children's present and their future are hugely impacted. It means loss of learning today and decreased opportunities and income for their future. I would like to conclude with some key recommendations on what we collectively can do to accelerate action and ensure that all children affected by internal displacement have access to services that supports their resilience and overall development. So we need to first understand what drives displacement and the unique impact the interplay of causes and effects have on children. We need collectively to invest more in developing these analyses. And the report today is a very good start and something we need to invest more in. Secondly, we need to ensure that children's rights and their best interests are at the very heart of policies, practices, and both short and long-term solutions, including access to protection, services, and reintegration programs. Having children's best interest as the center of our responses means that we are providing a continuum of care for children, integrating education, child protection, healthcare, psychosocial support, and other key services before, during, and after displacement. Thirdly, we need to recognize that child protection risks are exacerbated during displacement. Child protection is essential for children in the context of preparedness, in emergency, and in recovery situations. Adequate and sustained financial and non-financial resources for child protection are crucial. We know that child protection is unfortunately massively underfunded in most humanitarian responses. Fourth and lastly, we need to ensure access to education. And as part of this, investment in strong and resilient education systems that are accessible to displaced communities and are able to support the reintegration of displaced children are needed. We need more examples of successful integration of internally displaced children in national education systems. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Inge, for these words. I think you've said a lot here, and again, a lot that resonates with the findings of our report and with some of the discussions that we've already had. I think 4 points in particular that you've mentioned. One is, of course, acknowledging the full scale of this issue. I mean, the mere fact that half of the world's IDP population today are children makes it, I think, all the more staggering or remarkable that they're not better reflected and more visible in global but also national policies and policy making and operational responses. That is already a gap that I think needs to be corrected and needs to be corrected soon. The second point that you've reminded us all of is that, of course, displacement creates very specific vulnerabilities. You know, my colleague Christelle this morning was saying that when we first started research into understanding children's the way in which internal displacement impacts children and young people across the world, we had to ask ourselves, you know, how are we going to disentangle the effects of a conflict or the effects of a disaster from those that are specific to displacement within that context or that disaster, and are they not all the same? And in fact, what at least our case study work shows, and from what you've both said already, Nina and Inge just now, I think it's very clear that displacement creates very specific vulnerabilities that also have to be treated as such. And this brings me to the third point, which you've mentioned, which is very much the need for much more child-focused approaches, recognizing that children are not one single homogeneous group, and that they're very, very different from one person to another, and certainly from one context to another too. So again, the lack of child-friendly policies to start with, and now also the lack of child-specific and targeted responses, I think, are clear gaps. And then finally, Inge, you've touched on another key issue, which is on funding. You've mentioned funding, or the lack of funding, or insufficient funding for child protection in crises, but also in longer-term protracted situations. We also talked this morning about insufficient investment and funding for building national statistical capacity for better capturing the needs of children and young people caught up in displacement, so that we are in a better position to inform policy. So I think the funding issue is another key element here that we may want to come back to in the discussion. Thank you very much, Inge. Moving on to Ehab. Ehab Badoui, CEO of the Syrian Youth Assembly. It's a pleasure to have you with us. Ehab was supposed to be with us in Geneva today, but from actually a very good news on his behalf. He's just been granted German citizenship. You've become a German citizen, so congratulations to you, Ehab.
Thank you.
And that means that he was not able to travel today. So we have to make do with your virtual appearance, but really, really pleased to have you with us. So we've talked a lot about children so far, and early childhood and older children, but what are some of the challenges associated with the transition to young adulthood, and what is it like really being a young adult fleeing your home and experiencing very specific obstacles along the way? And what would be your recommendations for providing better support in the future to this future generation of perhaps policymakers and responders? Over to you, Ehab.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, first of all, for having me here with you today. I hope I will be able to share some of those challenges and sharing from my personal experience as well. As like I spent like 9 years of my life as a refugee, someone who really forced to be forced to leave his country and got to live in different difficulties. And I see always here like how similar the challenge I get to live as a refugee with the same challenge they living the young people as IDP people. And like when I'm trying to do like to understand exactly what this challenge including is like one from the most important thing where this is give us the access as well to many different levels and participation. It's always the way of how we are able to give you those young people the possibility to participating in making their decision or being as well part of a peace process, and same times to access as well the possibility for different service from education, from development, from the way where they can really build the capacity and taking new skills can support them find in their way for having higher education or a job in different places. And like what I would like to mention here, like one of the most as well challenge I see here, like for young people, it's the possibility to integrate a new community. And what the challenge come with this possibility to integrate with it, like sometimes it can be with different culture way, or sometimes it can be not able to access education because they miss paper. It's not easy to get in university, and how it's easy really to integrate those young people back again, like an educational system where they are right now. As well, like with speaking about the challenge of who able really like to include those young people in the social level and the social cohesion itself, how we are able really to organize different possibility and activity, give them like the possibility back to be part of the community and society, make them able to be active here. Who is responsible on give them the possibility really to integrate themselves and as well receiving new experience and development, like to be able to go to the job market in the future. All those challenges as well include about how the community look to them, about look, they are refugee, they are really totally different social class. Doesn't matter who they are, like in which level they get from education, from experience, they always look like they are different. And like dealing with those people as well, sometimes like it's need us to deal with them with different way. Always I give the example of the between of the refugee student, for example, and the international student. The refugee student, like they are more really like international student with special need. It's mean really they have different need we have to focus on. We cannot put them together in the same level with the other student who don't live the same life of those people. And this is the first point here, trying to understand those people exactly as they are new to the community and try to develop in a way to deal with them with their different challenge we have. As well, those young people, when they moved here, doesn't mean they forget everything about their their home. It's mean they still trying to participate in social and political level. And participating in social and political level, it needs a lot of experience. And to start as well, it start with protection. Who will able to give those young people the way to be able to participate there? I'm today talking to you from Germany. I'm Syrian, but I'm trying really to be part of the Syrian peace process. But I'm still afraid to be there. I have despair about, okay, who will protect me if I'm near there? Who will protect my family? Who will protect my friends? Like if they let's say they see my participation, it's illegal in the end. And making all this possible, really, like the recommendation, it should be about we have like to first of all try to work with those young people together, not to work for those young people. It's mean when we try to develop anything, let's develop it with them. Try as well to take care of their special needs. Try to understand what exactly the special need they need here, and let's make this regarding to the need of those young people, not be regarding the policy of our donors and the funding we have. It's mean always like we have to find a project fit with those young people more than our funding should be able to fit with those young people. Focusing as well on funding, like funding, it's very limited. And as well, the young people organization funding as well, very, very limited. Like they don't, until today, they don't look to us as we are able to lead like in a process of development. They don't look to us as we are able to, like, for example, to lead the policy in any situation. And this is like the less of respect of the young people experience is still like in a gap for us between to be get integrated in the system and at the same time to be able to support. And we have really to try to change this mindset about how we look to the young people as they are active and really real active in this process. Focusing on like giving young people the empowerment, like from the level about we believe they have to get integrated in the job market. Let's try to work with them and develop their experience, the experience they have to be able to integrate in the job market. It's very difficult to tell someone after 4 years, for example, of study and taking experience about you have to change your career because it doesn't fit here. It doesn't fit with us. Okay, like what about my last 4 years? Like this is very important to try to find something really come with those young people, fit in those young people, more than let young people fit with the new system we have. My last recommendation, really, please try to take care on funding. Funding, it's make everything possible. Like it's help us really to develop all our study, to understand the situation of young people, try to launch different reports, try really to focus on the need of those young people and to increase the participant of those young people in different situations. Yep.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ehab. Thank you very much, Ehab. I think what you've touched on is I'm hoping will also be the focus of the next part of the discussion on the participation of young people into the decisions that will ultimately shape their lives. And it would be interesting to understand a little bit more what you see as some of the key obstacles for this participation not always being optimal. You talked about funding. Or insufficient funding to enable youth associations to be actually sitting around the table more regularly. But you also talked about a lack of respect for young people and a need to change mindsets. So we may also want to come back to that. But I think another very important aspect that has come out of that when we talk about participation and the need for young people to feel that they are participating so that they can integrate into the community that ends up hosting them and where they end up finding refuge. And I think this is an important reflection when we think about internal displacement and durable solutions to internal displacement, where we often tend to think as a collective. We can't help it. We often think about durable solutions being about only return. There's very little reflection and investment that's been made into really understanding what would be needed to allow people who don't necessarily want to return and who would be more than happy to actually locally integrate where they've arrived, and what needs to happen for that to be even possible. And this is where I think better listening to the voices of young adults in those contexts would be key. So thank you very much, Ehab. I may come back to you in a bit. Well, I think we've had a very comprehensive overview, thanks to our first three speakers, of the many, many challenges and obstacles that the children and young people face in displacement. And they've already touched on what some of the responses have been and where the gaps still are. So I'd like to now zoom in a little bit more on what can be done. And let's zoom in on one country in the world in particular, which is Nigeria. We have Ms. Suleiman Ibrahim here with us today, who represents the government of Nigeria's response to internal displacement. She has a very big agenda on her plate. But it would be very, very interesting for us to hear in your perspective where young children and young adults fit within Nigeria's durable solutions vision and strategy. And again, what are some of I know that you face many obstacles, but I think there are also a lot of opportunities on the horizon, and it would be very useful to hear how you're approaching this challenge in your role as commissioner for this group of people. So, Ms. Suleiman, please tell us a little bit more what everything looks like in Nigeria.
Thank you very much, Alexandra. I would start by paying my respects to Her Excellency, Safia Ahmed Nuhu, our Ambassador to Romania, the Nigerian ambassador to Romania. Thank you so much for being here and for your interest in this area. I would like to also recognize and congratulate and applaud the team IDMC for this laudable initiative and for not just staying the course, but enabling us and affording us this platform to come regularly to assess and to access the vital information and deliberate on the way forward. Other members of the panel, thank you for your contribution, distinguished participants. In the last 15 to 20 years, the world has been facing an unprecedented humanitarian crisis like we've never seen before. So for me, I feel the last few years have been trial and error, piloting phases, trying to kind of understand what is happening, especially for our country, Nigeria. Because once upon a time, it was a very peaceful country with little or no crisis, and then here we are engulfed by not just natural disasters, but also man-made disasters that have all sorts of implications. So we've had our own fair share of those challenges. Over 50% of our population of internally displaced persons are youths and children. That is huge. They're not just the future leaders, but they are the backbone of society. Hence the need for us to have not just a coordinated, but a concerted approach to addressing issues for these young people. So we've put together very intentional and very strategic plans in place. I assumed duty about 1 year ago, and I've inherited a lot of programs, and I've been able to also in place a lot of new ones. And I see this particular challenge as an opportunity for us to help these young people redefine themselves, reinvent themselves in a better way. We just heard from one of the speakers that if you're a child born in the camps, due to the protracted nature of displacements in the world, it's more likely that you're going to grow up in those camps. So we must not just have programs in place to help you grow in a wholesome manner, but we must also have exit strategies to these issues of displacements. Most of the IDPs in Nigeria are in host communities, not in camps. So we tend to realize that these host communities are overstretched. There's competition for resources. So our plan evolves around helping them, not just with their coping mechanisms, but building resilience for these internally displaced persons and also for their communities by taking in more services, increasing the capacity of schools, the healthcare facilities, and being more innovative beyond the basic needs of these IDPs, especially the youths and the children. So what are we doing about it? We're trying to strengthen policies. Our commission is saddled with the responsibilities of offering assistance and protection to internally displaced persons and other persons of concern like the returnees, the migrants, the refugees, and people at the risk of becoming stateless. But in 2015, we've had a migration policy. Prior to that, we were also party to the assenting of the Kampala Convention. And then in 2019, the federal government decided to institutionalize all our humanitarian efforts. And we have now a ministry, a coordinating ministry, a supervisory ministry for every humanitarian intervention for government. So we're becoming more institutionalized so that we can begin to roll out strong policies. In 2021, our IDP policy was being approved by the Federal Executive Council. And just a few weeks ago, we've begun the process of domesticating our Kampala Convention within our country as a standalone bill. It was part of our commission's bill, but now it's going to be a standalone bill so that other stakeholders, other players can also own the Kampala Convention. We're working more intentionally and strategically with states and non-state actors. So it's whole of society, whole of government approach. No one government can do it alone. We're looking at child protection issues, we're taking it seriously, working with the relevant partners like the Ministry of Women Affairs, the NAPTIP, the National Agency for Provision of Trafficking in Persons. They are the custodians of the VAP Act, the Violence Against Persons Act, which also gives legislative protection to children and to vulnerable people. And also, we're working on a national action plan, a policy that will help us to, to institutionalize durable solution, an SOP on durable solution. This would also give us a framework on exiting camps as quickly as possible. We have also adopted a few project drivers just to excite ourselves and also excite beneficiaries and our partners. One of them being the Project Zero Hunger. One of the key challenges for displaced people is food insecurity and addressing their nutritional needs. And the government can't do it alone, so we've launched the Project Zero Hunger. This will help us not just to eliminate waste around provision of food and non-food items for IDPs, but this will also encourage other partners and give them like a clear framework to be able to participate and support these vulnerable people in need, and it's been driven by the creative industry. They're the lead. We have the project Resettlement cities. When displacement happens, people lose their homes. So as a government, we're in the third phase of resettling these people. It's a piloting phase, and each one is very distinct to the kind of people because they all have different needs when it comes to their housing needs. So it's not like a standard prototype, no. We're customizing it to be fit for purpose. We have the project Educate All, so this will help to address their learning and emergency needs. We have transitional learning centers within these resettlement cities and within host communities and camps. We're building additional schools. And we're not just looking at the basic education, but also the vocational skills. Because some of these kids have been in the camp for a while, and they require more than just basic education. They require to strengthen their skills. So we look at their key areas of interest as well, so that we can upskill them. And in doing so, we're partnering with a lot of government agencies that have those kind of funding. For example, recently we've partnered with the NIDA, the National IT Coordinating Agency for Nigeria. They have a similar mandate to achieve 90% computer literacy for the Nigerian citizens by 2030. So we've signed an MOU to start with the pilot phase of 10,000. We've so far done 1,200. It's exciting in 6 locations. And after that, we can be able to upscale those numbers. So we're working around ICT to see that we give them those basic skills. And I was so excited. The first day I went to one of those trainings, and 80% of the beneficiaries are youths. But 20% will allow for other people to also benefit from the project ICT, the project Skill Up. So when I went to the first training and I asked this lady, I said, "What did you learn today?" It's amazing. She's over 60 years. The excitement, she could define a computer, and she knows exactly how she's going to use those skills. And I think regardless of what you would like to do, what career you like to pursue, it's very important that you have your ICT skill, in place. Also, partnering with the Ministry of Youth and Sports, we're trying to roll out sports activities for these youths. It's a lot of numbers, and they all have different interests. But I know that they can be able to offer a lot in the areas of, rebuilding their lives and also nation building, which is very important. We pay attention to, and we support them in playing their own roles as citizens. So we're partnering with the Ministry of Youth and Sports to see how we can involve them in various sports competition and also in training them in that area. We'll be partnering with the SA to the President on Youth Development. They have a lot of funding and projects that we can also benefit from. And also the private sector. For example, one of the local automobile assemblers, the Inoso Motors, has pledged to train about 100 of them as a pilot as well. And then we can be able to expand the scope of the piloting. There's a project Total Health. So we're looking at also establishing health facilities around these host communities. Some of them have none, some have, maybe very little. We've worked with the National Primary Healthcare Commission to ensure that there's access to the COVID-19 vaccine for the people in the host communities and the camp. That was also a very successful drive. We're also upskilling and equipping the existing health facilities in the camps. And also there's a project ICT. This doesn't have a direct connection with the youths and the children, but it's an internal thing for our commission. We're rolling out as a smart commission to be able to manage our data properly, to be able to monitor and evaluate our programs better. This would help in unhindered access to protection and assistance for these youths, because on their own they can be able to register, delist themselves as IDPs, and state exactly what their requirements are. In conclusion, I would like to state that we're aware of the challenges. We now see it more as a challenge, an opportunity for us to be able to redefine the future for these young people. And we're looking at it as a humanitarian development drive, not as a humanitarian challenge like it was seen before. So, we invite whole of society, all our partners to come in and, support us in driving the process for these young people. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thanks very much, Iman. There's again a lot in what you've just said about the importance of a normative framework really underpinning all of the work, and I think Nigeria is a good example of having a dedicated IDP policy, but also now SOPs for durable solutions and for camp exiting, etc. So the foundation upon which all this work needs to be built is very much first on the policy side. And then you've talked, of course, about the importance of a whole-of-government approach to this issue. The collaborations that you've been able to develop with the private sector in particular, I think it would be great if you could tell us more about this in the second segment, maybe with the Q&A, because this is one of the key recommendations as well of the high-level panel on internal displacement, to really find new ways of engaging development actors, but also other parts of society, including the private sector. But I think it's always been difficult to understand how best to incentivize them to come in to respond to the needs of displaced people. So any lessons that you may have on that would be hugely relevant. And then, of course, you've talked about ICT and sort of digital focus. ICT in this case, as I understand, when it comes to kind of skills training for young people, beyond responding to immediate educational needs. But I think it's also interesting to think about this in terms of, in general, kind of facilitating young people's access to information, which is key to their participation ultimately in public affairs and in a social and political life. And then, of course, you've touched on, you were saying in Nigeria, you've put an emphasis on collaboration with the sports ministry, which I think also echoes with what Nina was saying earlier about the role of play as well in overcoming some of the trauma, but also building social cohesion and helping, accompanying young people in resuming their social relationships. So I think there are a lot of lessons to be learned there. As you said, huge focus also needed on monitoring and evaluation, understanding how we can track this progress over time. It's one thing to invest today, but what will those investments look like in 10, 20 years' time? And how can we effectively accompany children and young people throughout a longer period so that we can see whether the investments that we're making today will ultimately have a durable impact in the future. So thank you very much for sharing that. There may be some questions to you in a minute. I'm just looking at the time, and I would like us to finish this first round. By now, giving the floor to Ms. Wikramanayake to tell us a little bit more about youth participation and inclusion in decision-making, really at the highest levels of policy-making, at the global level, perhaps also at the regional level. Mr. Badoui touched on what he has experienced and what his peers have experienced when it comes to participating in social and political life in their immediate surroundings. But what can you say to us, Jayatma, from your role as UN Special Envoy for Youth? What are you seeing in terms of the progress or not that is being made for giving a more systematic voice to young people, not just in understanding the scale of the problems that we're facing today, but also in involving them in the solutions that we can find. I'm going to just hand straight to you. I can't actually see you anymore. I'm assuming that you're still with us.
Yes, Alexandra.
Yes. Oh, great.
Thank you very much for the question. And one of the challenges of being the last speaker is that a lot of things you wanted to say have already been said. So I'll try to keep it very short, but I want to congratulate you and your team at IDMC for bringing forward these voices of internally displaced children and young people, and for providing us with these rich insights to support informed decision making about young people's and children's lives. One of the best things that I love about this report is that you not only highlight the data and the issues, but you dedicate an entire chapter to talk about the leadership that young people are providing in situations of displacement. And I think it's so important in terms of shifting this narrative of seeing young people and children as only beneficiaries, really understanding and recognizing and empowering their role as active agents of change in their society. So I will start my intervention from there. As the report highlights very well, we have very little reliable age disaggregated data, meaning that young people are often invisible in the evidence that informs decision making. So only by bridging this gap of such a large part of the population at such a transformative age that we can truly understand and empower and act upon young people's specific needs. So connected to that, their participation in local, regional, and intergovernmental multilateral processes particularly is extremely important, and is of course at the core of my mandate as the Secretary General's Envoy on Youth. In order to understand the nature of their participation, I think it's important to acknowledge that young people are disproportionately exposed to multidimensional crises that are impacting our societies right now, with the report rightfully highlighting how new generations are highly vulnerable and exposed to disaster, displacement, and future generations will be more so, unfortunately. And as the report clearly defines, displacement's impact on children and young people are not felt equally because children and young people are not a homogeneous group. Their experience vary depending obviously on their age, on their gender, on disability, and other characteristics and identities that they belong to. Neither are these impacts felt only by the individuals in question, but also by their families and by their communities. And they're not only felt only locally or in the moment, as the report says, and that they have repercussions on economies and in societies as a whole for years and years and generations to come. But young people are hardly the victims in this case, because as we see and we heard from IHAB and from the commissioner right now, while facing these multifaceted challenges in displacement, they're also showing incredible resilience. They're not only resilient, but actually they're resourceful in these crises as well. They are always at the front lines. They are always the front runners. They're acting in communities. They're mobilizing. They're organizing at the grassroots level when it comes to issues affecting their communities. I got to see this firsthand in my visits to IDP camps in Iraq, in Bangladesh, in South Sudan, where they're driving for positive change in their communities, immediately responding to crises that arise. So even with so much stake for their present and for their future, young people often face challenges influencing decision-making due to various reasons. And I think IHAB spoke a lot about these challenges, from lack of space to safety concerns in participating, to lack of financial and other resources that enable them to meaningfully take part. And this becomes more challenging, of course, for internally displaced people whose access to resources and spaces are even more limited. I see this as a waste of potential, because young people's enthusiasm, their expertise, and their commitment should be tapped into. Young IDPs, for an example, must be encouraged to express their wants and needs and invited to take part. And and take an active part in planning and implementing interventions that affect them and their communities, and their aspirations and local initiatives should be strengthened with local, regional, and global support in terms of financial and non-financial resources. Now, to answer the second part of your question and sort of drawing inspiration from how young people participate, particularly at the UN and multilateral level, learning from these community experiences that we heard from Ehab and Inga and the Commissioner, when we look at the discussions on youth engagement at the global level, there is this underlying notion of placing the responsibility on young people to play a key role in implementing these policies and programs without really empowering them to have that power to create that change. How can you expect young people on their own to promote and implement decisions that they had no role in creating? You simply cannot. So this is why it's important to provide platforms and create safe spaces for young people to actively influence decisions, policies, programs that are shaping their lives and the lives of their communities. So we've tried to do this at the intergovernmental level, particularly at the UN level, inspired by the youth strategy of the Secretary General of the UN, which we call Youth 2030. For an example, every year we convene ECOSOC Youth Forum, Council of the Economic and Social Council Youth Forum, where we bring young people in all their diversity together to debate with the ministers of youth affairs from their countries and evaluate how their countries are progressing on the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals. Another example is the Youth Advisory Group that the Secretary General established to advise him on climate change issues and implementing his climate strategy. And another example that I can give you is the recently concluded Beijing Plus 25 process, or the generation equality process, where there was a guided efforts to place young people in leadership roles, in the action coalitions, establishment of a youth task force, and young people contributing to global review processes. Of course, I share these as good examples, but all of them are not perfect. There's so much more work to be done. And this progress is slow, even though it is happening and picking up across the UN system from global to regional and country level. And it has to be extended to spaces that makes decisions, but also spaces that makes, say, sensitive decisions, sometimes as we call them in the UN, from issues of refugees to issues of displacement to issues of migration, where we see the participation of civil society and young people continue to shrink. So my main message today is really opening up those spaces, recognizing young people as equal stakeholders, equal partners, respecting their agency, respecting their leadership, and moving away from the idea of just having young people in the room to tick a box, but to really recognizing the issue of participation as an integral part of the human rights-based approach. Young people and children have a right to participate in decisions that affect their lives, including the most marginalized and vulnerable groups in society, such as internally displaced young people. So we have to make sure that their participation is not only in numbers, but in quality and in meaningfulness in terms of power sharing with the actors who otherwise are making decisions on their behalf. So I'll just end with how you named the chapter on youth leadership, which is let them lead. Most of the world's IDPs are under the age of 24, so let's let them lead and take those decisions that affect their lives and shape their lives and bring our world to a better place than it is in right now. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Jayatma. Thank you very much, Jayatma. I think that was a great intervention to end on for this first round. A good reminder of some of the obstacles that, as you said, Ehab had already touched upon when it comes to the insufficient spaces for dialogue and for including or ensuring that young people's voices are reflected, the lack of that feeling of safety that is so needed before people can come forward and feel that they have that they can and that they want to contribute, and of course issues relating to funding. It was also good to hear from you about some of the more promising initiatives that you've been involved in at the UN level, intergovernmental processes where young people have been more meaningfully involved recently. I still feel that we still haven't really touched. If I may just sort of follow up with one question to you, because completely, I think we all agree in this room that participation has to be more about, it can't just be tokenistic, it has to be about quality, engagement. There needs to be a mind shift. We need to respect, young people's agency and leadership. But what do you see as really the key obstacle right now for that not systematically happening? Or what would you advise, all of us here today that we should do differently in the future, or small steps that we could take to gradually get to that to that participation and that inclusion becoming more automatic? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think one of the things is really breaking those myths and misconceptions, stereotypes we have about young people, right? For an example, in our interventions today, we have shared how young people are not only beneficiaries in humanitarian settings, but really are also leaders, and they are hardly recognized for their leadership role. But when it comes to, say, sitting in a parliament or sitting at the UN and making these decisions, we look at how many numbers of years of experience do you have, or we have these stereotypes and misconceptions about who should be a leader. I think the first is debunking that and recognizing and appreciating that everyone is a leader in their own right. Particularly young people are the experts of their own lived realities, because they grow up in a very different world than the generations before them grew up in. So I think first is to really recognize that expertise and value that expertise, and consider that as a contribution and as an opportunity than an obstacle for them to be invited into these spaces. And secondly, I think there are so many other barriers that we often don't think of that keeps young people away from these rooms where the decisions are being made. Ihab spoke lengthily about funding for youth organizations, and we know about 90% of youth organizations are informal voluntary networks of young people coming together to solve problems in their communities. They're not registered NGOs. So for an example, if you think about attending a meeting at the UN or getting a visa to travel to a conference to talk about these issues, they face huge challenges, not only financial, but also in terms of legal challenges, in terms of this recognition, in terms of funding. So there are multiple layers. And then even if you access these spaces, sometimes the language is not youth friendly, the language is not child friendly, and you're not really felt welcome in these spaces. So I think it's also important to recognize the diversity in youth participation, but also be very age responsive and age sensitive when it comes to working with young people in partnership.
Great. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Emma. Thank you very much to all our speakers for some wonderful interventions, a lot of food for thought. Unfortunately, the time is going very fast, and I'd like to give the opportunity to our audience, both here and in person and with us in Geneva and online, to ask you questions. If there are any follow-up questions to what has been said, or if you have your own reflections about this issue, now is your time. We have about 25 minutes for a Q&A. I've already received some questions. I'm not being rude by looking at my phone, by the way. This is questions coming from the audience. There are a couple already here, but I don't know if there's. Well, this is where my glasses are going to come in handy. If there are some questions from the audience, I'd be happy to take them. Yes, Ambassadeur Konaté, you have the floor.
Je vous remercie de me donner la parole et je voudrais féliciter l'IDMC d'avoir pris l'initiative d'organiser ce dialogue autour de la présentation annuelle de votre rapport. J'ai écouté avec beaucoup d'intérêt la plupart des intervenants qui ont partagé l'expérience qu'ils ont du traitement spécifique de la jeunesse dans le cadre des déplacements internes. Je voudrais dire à ce propos que, étant ressortissant d'un pays qui est concerné dramatiquement par ce phénomène, un phénomène qui est imputable à un bouleversement géopolitique qui est intervenu dans la région du Sahel à partir de 2012, c'est-à-dire de l'effondrement de la Libye. Excusez-moi. Et l'effondrement de ce pays a eu un impact assez traumatisant pour l'ensemble de la région, a exacerbé des conflits qui étaient sous-jacents, a permis de développer l'extrémisme violent qui a eu pour effet pervers de déraciner un certain nombre de populations. La population dans mon pays a en moyenne moins de 25 ans. Les déplacés internes subissent un traumatisme qui est d'autant plus, disons, aigu pour cette frange de la population qu'elle a pour effet, et c'est là-dessus que je voudrais insister parce que je crois que cette question n'a pas été suffisamment abordée, c'est qu'au-delà des difficultés d'accès à l'éducation, au-delà des difficultés d'accès à des services de santé, au-delà des difficultés d'accès à une nutrition de qualité, ces populations subissent des stress post-traumatiques. Et le traitement de ce stress post-traumatique, je pense, n'est pas suffisamment pris en compte. Et des organisations comme telles que celle de Children, qui interviennent dans plus de 120 pays et dans le mien, pourraient être invitées à réfléchir sur la manière dont on peut prendre en charge ce stress post-traumatisme et les troubles psychologiques qui y sont liés. Nous avons des structures telles que la Direction nationale du développement qui interviennent pour encadrer la jeunesse, mais le gouvernement malien est distrait par d'autres priorités. Nous consacrons plus de 25% de nos ressources budgétaires aux dépenses de sécurité. C'est autant de fonds qui ne sont pas investis dans des programmes sociaux de base. L'attention de la communauté internationale également est distraite par les effets qui ne sont pas encore estompés de la Covid-19, par les nouvelles crises qui surgissent dans le monde, et je pense en particulier à la crise ukrainienne, ce qui fait qu'il est très difficile en interne comme à l'externe de mobiliser les énergies, de mobiliser les attentions pour venir prendre en charge ce problème. Mais je voudrais insister sur ce point particulier qui n'a pas suffisamment été évoqué, qu'est le stress post-traumatique et l'oisivité dans laquelle se retrouvent ces enfants. Et cette oisivité, si elle n'est pas comblée, elle pousse ces enfants à la délinquance, à la prostitution, à la consommation des stupéfiants. Donc voilà ce que j'avais à dire sur ce point bien spécifique, la prise en charge du stress post-traumatique des enfants, objet du déplacement interne.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur l'Ambassadeur. Merci de vous être rejoint à nous aujourd'hui. Very important question from Ambassador Konate from Mali, which actually connects well to a question that we've received online. And if I may, I'm going to direct it to you, Iman, regarding this issue of post-traumatic stress disorder in children affected by internal displacement. The question is there a plan in Nigeria to include to support the psychosocial needs of IDPs and to include this dimension to durable solution strategies and to future investments? How are you dealing with this trauma?
You know, back home, I think it's an African thing. It's not a very comfortable topic talking about mental health, but I think we're becoming more aware. As a commission, we now have a focal person and a unit that deals with psychosocial support for children and for people in the camps. We're collaborating with our partners like the UNHCR to strengthen our capacity. We've begun piloting programs, and we've been upskilling our staff around academia in Nigeria, going for trainings, and we're partnering with the NAPTIP, the National Agency for Prohibition of Trafficking in Persons, because they have a pool of counselors, because they also are the custodians of the VAP Act. So they have the counselors that we can access for. Just recently, our returnees from Ukraine, they're beneficiaries of some kind of psychosocial support. It's ongoing. So we're intensifying efforts around that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. I don't know if any of the other speakers would like to react to this question, on psychosocial support, how to ensure children's well-being and how to cope with the stress and the trauma that is often caused by displacement. Are there any reactions from either of you? Inga?
Yes, please. I would love to comment, and thank you, Mr. Ambassador, for this very important question. I don't think it can be overstated that this is an area of great concern when we meet children in these situations. And last week in Mozambique, just to paint a picture, in Cabo Delgado, I was visiting a school where they, before the conflict, had 300 students, and now they have 970. So with the same structure, they are taking care of 3 times as many children. And the ability to give access to education, quality education, in a situation like that, where a lot of the children, as Mr. Ambassador is saying, is suffering of post-traumatic stress, is an absolute challenge. So what needs to be done, and I've seen similar situations in Sahel, which is the region that the ambassador spoke about. But I think making sure that we have an understanding of this challenge, making sure that we are trying to support the schools to address it is critical. So the children often respond in humanitarian situations with what we call child-friendly spaces. And one of the things that we focus most on is exactly this, giving psychosocial support. And last week, I was participating in one of our programs where one of our our psychologists was engaging with the children, and through play, through art, are trying to get children to canalize some of these feelings. And similarly, in Ukraine, another example is that we had 2 young children coming to one of our child-friendly spaces, and often we let them play and draw and paint to manage their feelings. And there was a 12-year-old girl. She was drawing an image of a woman wrapped in a Ukrainian flag, and then a plane dropping bombs on her. So even if she was safe, but she lived in fear. So I think this is something that we cannot underestimate, and this is something that we really need to have at the core and the center of all our responses. So thank you for highlighting that.
Thank you very much. I saw that Ambassador Andisha was asking for the floor. Ambassador Andisha from Afghanistan, over to you.
Thank you very much, Alexandra. I would like to begin by thanking the IDMC and also all the panelists for their presentation, and I really benefited from the speakers' really in-depth analysis and experiences that they have shared with us. I wanted just to have a question, a query. But before that, children and youth are often connected rightly with the hope, future, and development. And I think that the focus of this year's report on youth and children and internal displacement is very timely and welcoming initiative. And that also given that this report comes at the end of almost 3 years of very high-level attention to the plight of IDPs internationally in form of a Secretary General's high-level panel, which culminated in a very comprehensive report that you alluded to, and also a very focused recommendation on how to work for a durable solution, as well as recently the appointments of a special envoy. I think there's a perfect storm, not in the terms of disaster risk, but in a way that we can utilize this. So my question from all the participants and the presenters, which actually covered very important aspects of youth and children and displacement, is that what can you all do to highlight and mainstream children and youth-sensitive policies and projects at the nexus of development and peace building, given that we have a very important high-level document which has also attracted a lot of attention in the development world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Actually, that was a question that also came up this morning. You know, how child-friendly or youth-friendly is the high-level panel's report on internal displacement, and do we feel collectively that this group, this huge group of people has been adequately represented in it? I don't know who would like to tackle this question, which is about how to best now mainstream children and youth issues in not just global policy making, but also national policy development around this issue. Perhaps if there are some concrete examples that you can think of where these children and youth considerations are very much the red thread, let's say, in a policy relating to displacement. Are there any examples there? Yes, Ehab.
I think one from the example I can give, it's about how we are able to include the biggest number of young people in a peace process we try to have it. From our activity, we did youth consultation, where we try to be able really to bring many of those young people in a space, in a safe space, can give them the possibility to share their ideas, their knowledge. We try to build like in a round table activity where we are able really to bring those young people, discuss an issue it's matter to them. We try to open the debate with different activity to teach them the culture of dialogue, how we are able to deal with the issue related to us. We work together with different organization, agency to be able to organize like this call of action and to collect the information to sign, to design the recommendation and to present it in the right way to the who we think they are like policy maker. And I remember here one of the activity we did with the Special Envoy Office, it was about the protection, where we exactly come to understand how we are able as young people to find our protection to be able to participate in the peace process. And this has happened before the Doha conference this year. And this was one of the way to try to include the biggest number of those young people in this process and try to hear from them and to develop with them all this idea. Absolutely, always with the support of many experts in this field who are able really to help us to make those young people able to explain what exactly this is mean for them, what exactly the challenge they have here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ehab. Yes, Jayatma.
I can come in here, Alexandra.
Yes.
I think probably I'm not sure if anyone else is aware, but I'm unable to pinpoint to say that, this is one policy that I think at the national level is truly representative of the voices of young people and their concerns because of the challenges that we spoke in the panel, and we see very less participation, not because young people don't want to participate, but because of the structural challenges that we were talking about. For an example, even if you take the world's parliaments today, only about 2.6% of the world's parliamentarians are under the age of 30, even though half of the world's population is under the age of 30. So our policy making, our decision making is not really representative of these voices. So it's hard to see policies that truly represent these needs and these rights. I mean, even at the UN, if you look at the special envoys that we were just talking about, I'm probably the only one under the age of 50, and it's very hard, therefore, to see this representation happening and really truly being reflected. But I wanted to bring your attention to one of the tools that are there in order to facilitate governments and humanitarian actors to do this, which was a product of the Young Compact for Young People in Humanitarian Action, which was launched at the World Humanitarian Summit. This compact has about 60 plus humanitarian actors working to ensure that the priorities of young people are addressed and informed, and they're consulted and meaningfully engaged throughout all stages of humanitarian humanitarian action. And the guidelines that were developed by the compact was actually adopted and launched by the Interagency Standing Committee in February 2021 as a part of the compact and representing a key deliverable from the World Humanitarian Summit. This guidelines launched by the Interagency Standing Committee is a landmark tool for humanitarian action because it was co-created with young people from all over the world. And the aim of these guidelines is to serve as the go-to guide for working with and for young people in humanitarian and protracted crises. So I really encourage everyone, particularly the governments who are in the room here today and the humanitarian organizations, to use the IAC guidelines as a tool to continue to integrate young people meaningfully in the policies and the programs that they will come up with in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Jayatma. And thank you, Ambassador Andisha, for this question. I think we can perhaps propose when the Secretary General's Special Advisor on Internal Displacement Solutions takes up his role in July this year, perhaps to introduce him to these guidelines if he doesn't know them already. I'm sure he already does, and perhaps to suggest some more in-depth consultations with young people to make sure that what comes next is child and youth friendly. I have a question for Nina from Mr. Negash Botora, who used to be, he was previously the permanent representative of Ethiopia here in Geneva. He's now, I believe that it's good to hear from you, by the way, Negash. I can't see you, but it's good to see this question from you. I believe that he's calling in from Addis. He's currently a member of IDMC's advisory group, and he is asking Nina, could you please share the experiences of the Sesame workshop in countries south of the Sahara, where the absence of radio and television is significant in remote areas?
Yeah, that's a great question. And this is something that Sesame Workshop has, I'm really proud to say, been leaning into as we move our work into more hard to reach locations. At the core of Sesame Workshop is a real understanding of age appropriate and developmentally appropriate needs of young children. And in many countries where we're working, where there is absolutely no connectivity, Sesame Workshop has been able to leverage our expertise for teaching and learning materials in the schools, and also sort of related to what we heard from Inger is, safe spaces for children, integrating play, this idea of emotion identification, et cetera. And another example we have is sort of in Afghanistan, where we had a really large program. We did community viewings of some of our shows, and that had sort of a multiple effects because, as we know from our research, is that children and their caregivers viewing some of our content together, it actually has a profound impact. And so we're really looking across a variety of platforms to reach young children.
Great. Thank you very much, Nina. Just looking to the room, are there any other questions? Yes. Please, if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Melissa Kellis. I'm a master's student in migration here in Geneva. And I'd like to ask, Mr. Anzolini, earlier you alluded to institutional problems that might ensue in the future due to internal displacement. So I ask the panel, can we say children and youth are impacted by internal displacement in an overarching way, as in once or even if a durable solution is found, can certain inequalities caused by their internal displacement as children persist in the long term? And I say caused by internal displacement because, as Ms. Christel had mentioned in the previous session, displacement itself creates specific vulnerabilities. Basically, what do we know about people who were displaced as children and are now adults who are potentially followed by their prior internal displacement? Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for this question. So you're asking about what we know about the longer-term effects or the cumulative effects of internal displacement on children who were displaced at a young age, right?
Okay, thank you so much for your question. It's actually very different for people. They have different levels of resilience, bounce back ability. For some people, they recover really quickly. For some, it takes them much longer. And in the initial phases of this displacement, we didn't have the right response to their psychosocial support. But I can tell you that we have a good number of people that have recovered really well. They have come back to even work within the commission or are working within the camps to help us to, with interventions, offering themselves, because they've been through the process. While we have other people that are suffering a lot of more adverse consequences due to the recovery mechanism in place. So it's relative and it's very different with different people. But I think that collectively, when we monitor and we evaluate the progress so far, we can be able to come up with stronger responses in that regard.
Thank you very much. I'm very conscious of the time. I would like to start wrapping up, so maybe I'll take one last question, please.
Yes, thank you very much. I will be brief. My name is Riyad Bazia. I'm a member of civil society based in Geneva. I used to be working in the coordination office for NGOs in the UN since more than 20 years ago. But I take the floor like to make a comment and to give also a contribution. Peut-être je vais le faire en français. Les déplacements internes ont été reconnus dans le droit international comme un crime contre l'humanité depuis les statuts de Rome, depuis 1998. Ce qui a donné aussi, 4 ans plus tard, en un temps assez court, la création de la CPI, la Cour pénale internationale. Mais lorsque les déplacements internes ont été considérés par le droit international, on pensait au passé, aux conséquences des indépendances, mais on n'avait jamais prévu qu'on allait vivre ce que nous vivons maintenant. Et c'est vrai que les déplacements internes sont devenus une problématique cruciale depuis la première et la deuxième décennie du XXIe siècle. Juste pour souligner sur l'importance du régionalisme et du sous-régionalisme, oui, c'est une question étatique de l'État. La souveraineté de l'État, c'est d'assurer la sécurité à tous ses citoyens, qu'ils soient dans leur propre pays ou bien ailleurs. Donc, ils ne migrent pas dans leur propre pays. Mais j'ai voulu aussi apporter ma contribution, c'est sur la disparition forcée des personnes pendant les conflits armés, qui était aussi un combat similaire et finalement adopté par la défunte Commission des droits de l'homme en 2006, une convention internationale des disparitions forcées pendant les conflits armés, et que cette question aussi, elle mérite d'être élaborée minutieusement dans la problématique, dans le cadre des déplacements internes dans les pays. Et que, voilà, j'aurais pas voulu dire ça en parenthèse, parce que de nos jours, elle est plutôt instrumentalisée pour des objectifs électoraux et politiciennes. Mais c'est très important de considérer la disparition forcée des personnes pendant le conflit armé ou même pendant les natural disasters dans le cadre des déplacements internes. Merci beaucoup.
Merci beaucoup pour votre intervention. I think just a good way to end this this segment on just a reflection on the many data gaps. You were talking about forced disappearances, but I think it's also about people who become invisible, basically, and who drop off the radar screen in these displacement situations that are very much at the core of our work and on all of our minds. I would like to now, before we close this session, I would like to give the opportunity to all our speakers to provide some closing remarks, perhaps to sum up with maybe 1 or 2 key takeaways that you are taking from this conversation, something that you may have forgotten to say or that has that you've been reminded of by the questions that have been asked. So if I could ask you all to be as brief as possible, unfortunately, because then we'll have the closing video message from Mr. Steiner from UNDP before we then make our way to the reception at 4:30. So perhaps I could start with you, Commissioner.
Thank you so much. I think my major takeaway from today's event is that, we're all on the same page. We recognize that it's very important that we don't only work with the coordinated effort, but with concerted efforts to eliminate waste, because a lot has been done for internal displacements, but it seems like a revolving door. We're not achieving the mileage or shrinking the numbers as much as we should. So there's need for better collaboration. And what I would like to say is that we'll continue to strengthen our policies, our institutions, to be able to have better responses to our issues and play our role, creating opportunities. We're seeking transfer of skills and technology. I know that there's more help out there, especially in the technical space. So we invite, global, regional, local players to come partner with us and to be our partners in progress. And I think for me, that will be it.
Thank you very much.
But we intend to work closely with these youths, with the beneficiaries to ensure that, because I can remember the quote that says, any decision made for us without us is against us.
Yes.
So that is the focal of this season for us when it comes to addressing issues of concerns for the persons of concerns, working closely hand in hand to address critical issues. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Commissioner, for sharing the experience of your government in dealing with this issue. If I could just hand over quickly to Inge, if you're still with us, Inge, I know that you needed to leave a little bit before the end. You are. Thank you so much for still being with us. So maybe I'll give you the floor first for your closing remarks.
Yeah, thank you so much, and thank you for a very good conversation and great questions. So a few words. What I think we've heard and seen today is that it has been further confirmed how inequality, conflict, environmental degradation, and the climate crisis are pushing more people into forced displacement. It's also very clear that children are among the most vulnerable people in these situations, and recognizing their specific needs and identifying child-focused responses is essential. Three things that I take away. The first, it is important to support and resource the participation of internally displaced children and youth. Their voices and their demands must be heard. The second is that I really welcome the appointment of the special advisor to the Secretary General on solutions to internal displacement, and encourage him to have a strong focus on children. And the third and final thing I want to say is that I really urge us all to act urgently to keep children's rights, including their views and demand, at the center of our responses of internal displacement. We owe it to the children in the world, and it's up to us to act now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Inge, and thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate to have had the perspectives of Save the Children around the table. Nina, would you like to go next?
Sure, thank you so much. I only regret that I'll be missing the reception.
Yes, next time in person.
So I have two key takeaways, and I think they're really cross-cutting across all the stages of development that we've talked about today. And it's really a call to action. And again, not very different than what we're hearing from my colleagues on the panel. First one is that we have to make sure that our efforts are locally led, and locally led by impacted populations. We have to ask ourselves, who is setting this agenda? And making sure that it's really set by the local expertise and actors. And then center our partnerships and relationships within the local knowledge, priorities, and expertise that exists. The second call to action is that our work really does need to be laser focused on children, and asking ourselves, what are children experiencing? And what are the age-appropriate outcomes, goals, measurements, and interventions that will lead to measurable success? And finally, I think in light of what we're hearing from the data today, what does the data say, and how can we push for better data and making sure that the decisions that we make around interventions are data informed? Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Nina. Great calls for action. Thank you. Jayatma, would you like to go next?
Thank you, Alexandra. 3 quick points. The first one is to remember that everyone has a right to participate in public affairs, and that right shouldn't be taken away from any child or young person just because they're displaced. Let's keep that in mind. The second one is that not every child and young person is the same. They're not a homogeneous group. Intersectional identities can really have an impact on how these crises affect them. It can be compounded for young women and girls. They're more vulnerable to child marriages. They're more vulnerable to teenage pregnancies. They're more vulnerable to dropping out of school than their male counterparts. It's even worse for young people with disabilities, young LGBTIQ people, young people from ethnic and religious minorities. So let's keep diversity in mind when we talk about targeting youth in our interventions, but also their participation. Third, it's so important to keep the life cycle approach in mind, because not on your 18th birthday, you suddenly become an adult. It's a transitional phase. And with most humanitarian crises becoming more and more protracted, we need to keep in mind that some children end up living in their entire childhood or youthhood in these situations. So keeping that life cycle approach is extremely important, and not considering them just as a target group or group of interest, but as real human beings with dignity, with needs, and with rights. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Jayatma, for those important reminders. And then you have the final word, Ihab. I wanted to end with you. So what are your thoughts from this discussion?
I think I cannot add much to what already said, but I will maybe again to remember about the work and the partnership with young people. It's very important. It's a try to really to invest in young people organization, try to build the capacity and the development for young people to make them able to participate in making this policy, providing them the platforms to be able to participate, making this together, and finally to provide the protection for them. Really, protection, it's big key. Today, I'm not able to participate in the peace process. I have fear. Who will protect me? This is very important to say it, because this is our right in the end to decide how this is work with us, how this fits us, and how our future should be as young people trying to design the future from today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ihab. Thank you so much to all of you. I think you've given us so much to think about. I know I'm speaking on behalf of my entire team at IDMC. We've learned a lot from first producing this grid. It was long overdue. We're very glad to have been able to pull together all the data and the information that we have on this topic. And I think by doing that, we've realized just how important this issue is and how relatively little attention it has received. So let's make that change. I think we've learned a lot from all of your interventions. I've noted these calls for action at the end. There is a whole agenda there for action. We will be sure to present this agenda to the Secretary General's Special Advisor when he takes up his functions, and we will be certainly having discussions with the rest of my team to see how we can mainstream these issues even in our own work moving forward. So thank you so much to all of you. Apologies for the initial few technical glitches. I'm glad that they worked out in the end. I'm now going to turn to UNDP Administrator Mr. Achim Steiner for his concluding remarks that he will be delivering via a video message.
Director of the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center, dear Alexandra Bilak, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues and friends. It is a privilege to bring this event to a close where we have heard from leading experts in the fields of child support, education, youth engagement and internal displacement. Firstly, I would like to congratulate colleagues at the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center for their sterling work on this year's Global Report on Internal Displacement. Combining the latest data, sharp analysis and clear recommendations, it puts the unique stories of people who are forced from their homes at its very center. As we have heard, it lays out how the global internal displacement crisis continues to deteriorate. 59.1 million people were displaced in their own countries in the year 2021, resulting in an economic cost of approximately $21 billion. And these sobering figures do not include the impact of the war in Ukraine, with some 8 million people internally displaced to date. It is already the world's largest internal displacement crisis, now precipitating an unprecedented global food, energy and finance crisis in many countries across the globe. Crucially, the report outlines the pressing need for investments in peace building as well as development strategies and solutions. This is vital to address the internal displacement crisis, which has a disproportionate effect on developing countries. This approach echoes the findings of the UN Secretary-General's high-level panel report on internal displacement, which calls for stronger national leadership and accountability for solutions based on strong data and evidence and, yes, commitment. Given the engagement of the United Nations Development Programme in countries across the world, including in Afghanistan and Ukraine, we keenly recognize that even amid conflict and crisis, development solutions cannot wait. Indeed, these lasting development solutions require the ideas and active engagement of young people, as highlighted also by this report. In UNDP, we are working with youth organizations in over 100 countries and territories, helping them to take a meaningful place at decision-making tables. On the continent of Africa, look to the Youth Connect initiative, which plans to support and empower 100,000 young African entrepreneurs, including displaced young people. And UNDP's Youth Innovation Challenge in the Asia-Pacific region is convening young innovators and social enterprises to roll out initiatives to improve the daily lives of communities, including internally displaced people. As the report highlights, more and better data on solutions is still needed. In this respect, today I'm pleased to announce a new joint research initiative by UNDP and the IDMC. It aims to contribute to the global body of knowledge on solutions to internal displacement. Combining data and in-country assessments, many for the first time, it will build data and evidence, helping governments to design, measure, implement, and invest in the world's very best development solutions to displacement at scale. Dear colleagues and friends, as conflicts and violence across the world continue to increase and the grip of climate change tightens, internal displacement will continue to shatter lives and livelihoods. The UN Secretary-General's upcoming action agenda on internal displacement clearly states that more of the same is not good enough. This starts with forging a better collective understanding what it takes to resolve internal displacement. That includes supporting nationally owned solutions that focus on prevention, mitigating the risk of future displacements, and, yes, reducing inequalities. Ultimately, this is about a shift in thinking to ensure that internally displaced persons, as equal citizens, can benefit from and drive forward the Sustainable Development Goals in every corner of our globe. Thank you.
Thank you very much to Administrator Steiner and to our colleagues from UNDP who are here today for preparing these concluding remarks and for joining us for the publication of our reports. I'm particularly pleased to hear Mr. Steiner echoing the global report's key findings. One of the starting points for choosing to put the focus on children and youth today was very much with a view to highlighting the cost of inaction. Inaction today will have a number of ripple effects into the future, and if we are to reduce the risk of internal displacement in the future, we need to make these investments now. Children and youth are very much the prism, I think, through which we can accelerate investments in prevention, disaster risk reduction, climate change adaptation, and of course, sustainable development. So we're very proud at IDMC to be partnering with UNDP on the initiative that Mr. Steiner just mentioned in building a stronger evidence base on the longer-term social and economic impacts of internal displacement so that we can inform more targeted solutions in the future. And certainly from our perspective, children and young people will have to be a red thread throughout this work and will have to be at the center of our approach. Let me now invite those of you who are here with us today to join us for the reception here at the CICG, just in the entrance hall. For those of you online, thank you so much for joining us. I wish you all a good rest of the day. A big thank you to all of you for having come here. It's been a pleasure to be back into a physical meeting mode. It's been a long time, but it feels really good. Thank you so much. Thank you, Commissioner, and all the best. And thank you to all our online speakers again for having joined us today. There you are. All the best. And next time, I hope to welcome you in person in Geneva. Bye-bye.